I just bought the book Bushcraft by Mors Kochanski, and I decided that instead of just putting it on the shelf, I would read it and try to practice the skills inside. In order to motivate myself to do so, I'm starting a little outdoors book club on my channel. The purpose of these videos is to share information, practice. I'm hoping to learn a lot in the process, and hopefully you will too. One other thing, I'm not an expert. If I was an expert, I wouldn't need to buy a book. You'll get to see what an average guy from Iowa does trying to practice these skills. You don't have to be a Superman to go outside. The book starts off with a chapter called Firecraft, and there's an opening quote by Mors Kochanski that says, "When all else fails, fire is the simplest means of providing comfort and warmth against cold and wet in the northern forests." And the first thing he talks about in this chapter is what it would be like if you were dressed in the old European fashion, you know, back when there were like woolly mammoths and things walking around, basically olden times. And people would wear like 25 pounds of wool clothing, and then if you were outside for 5 days and you didn't have a time to dry off, by the end of that you'd have enough frost and dampness in your clothing that it'd weigh 12 pounds more. He goes on to say that when you have that much frost and wetness in your wool clothing, it loses efficiency, and sooner or later you need to dry off. I looked at Mr. Kochanski's website, and he offers a winter survival course, and I was just curious what he recommends for the gear for that. And looking at it, he recommends basically the same stuff that I've learned to wear just growing up in a cold climate. I wear a thin layer of synthetics against the skin, and then wool, and then a shell. And for pants, same sort of thing, a thin layer underneath these, and then wool. And if we had any kind of real precipitation, what I would do would be to put on a shell, and he actually recommends just that for his winter survival course. I think one of the really crucial things that I've figured out about clothing living in a place where it's cold in the winter and hot in the summer is layering. And lots and lots of thin layers so that you can peel off clothing when it gets too hot and add clothing when it gets too cold. When I was a kid, I learned pretty quickly that you should wear climate appropriate and activity appropriate clothing. The clothing you're going to wear would vary quite a bit with what it is you're going to be doing. So it's freezing cold out, and I have on a really thin shirt and a super thin jacket and some sweatpants, a stocking cap, and some of these thin gloves. But I can do that because I'm running, and I've been running for half an hour, and I'm actually pretty comfortable in these clothing. But if I were to stop and, I don't know, lay down under a tree over there and try to sleep overnight, I'd probably wake up dead. Okay, so I've been hiking for a little bit and I've decided to stop. He says that the first thing you should think about when you decide to stop is lighting a fire if it's cold. He gives an idea for a test that you can do on yourself to see how cold you really are, and he shows there's a diagram that shows touching your thumb to your small finger. And if you have any difficulty at all doing that, you'd better build a fire real quick. He says that if you're real cold, what you probably need to do is do some exercise and jump around and things like that to warm yourself up, so that you don't fumble around while you're trying to light your fire and potentially, number one, waste energy, and number two, waste your ignition source and kindling. He goes on to talk about the 4 stages of fire, the first being ignition, the second being establishment, the third being application, and the fourth being maintenance and moderation. Now, ignition is pretty obvious. You light your fire and it gets going. Establishment is where it gets a little bit tricky. The idea is to light kindling and other small stuff on fire and then light bigger stuff so that you can build a fire that is sustainable even in wind, rain, cold, etc. And it's not going to go out without some considerable effort. Application is when you arrange your fire or build your fire in such a way that it suits the needs at hand. So there's a lot of reasons you'd build a fire. One might be you want to cook, another might be you want to warm up, another might be you want to dry some meat or dry clothing or something. Another might be you want to repel insects if it's that kind of year, and finally, like, you might want to build a signaling fire. So the application is just how you would arrange your fire to get to that point. The final stage of fire is maintenance and moderation, and what you're looking at in that stage is you're trying to build a fire in such a way that you don't have to mess with it all the time. So you don't have to constantly be getting up and stoking the fire and adding more fuel and things like that, and you know it's just going to burn for a while. Next, he gets a lot more specific about ignition, and looking ahead in the book a little bit, he talks about matches, flint and steel, and then a bow drill fire. I'm just going to talk about matches today so that I don't have such a long video. So he says that matches are the most convenient way to build a fire, and probably the most common way, and that when you're building it you just have to be really careful to protect your match from the wind and from weather and things like that. He points out the obvious fact that bigger matches burn longer. A kitchen match might burn for 40 counts, a paper match might burn for 15 counts, and a split paper match would burn for 5 counts. He recommends carrying your matches in a waterproof container and to carry 3 containers. You'd want to test your container as being waterproof by submerging it in water for 10 minutes before you would ever want to use it. It also needs to be really easy to open so that, you know, if you've got cold hands or something, you can open it up. He suggests 3 places of carrying your 3 containers, one in your pants pocket, another in your shirt pocket or somewhere else, and the final being your store of matches in your pack. And you would use the ones in your pack to replenish your other 2 sources. This one here is a match container made by Exotac. It's called the Match Cap. It's absolutely waterproof. I've tested it, and then it comes with the built-in striker right here, and then you can just replace that as you need to with another striker. One thing I've found with all outdoors equipment, but especially small things like matches, is that they are much better in my hands if they are in bright containers. Because I'm always setting them down, and if you set them down in this kind of stuff without some way of finding it, it's very easy to lose it. Unfortunately, a lot of outdoors manufacturers make stuff in camo and other dark colors that blend in real well out here. So if you're going to buy a match container, I would say buy one that's a bright color. The next thing he does in the book is he shows a match and lighting some kindling, and he shows that the hottest part of the match is when you're about 1 centimeter above where the match is. Then he shows a bunch of little pieces of kindling stretched out above it, and they should be about match size. When I was hiking in today, I saw a pine tree, and that's one of my favorite sources for kindling, because if you look on the underside, there's usually dry twigs and things on the very underside. So I just plucked you know, a few of this really dry stuff from the underside of that, and let's see if his method, if I can make it work here. I'm in a pretty sheltered area here, and there's no wind, so I'm not worried about wind blowing this out. So let's see if we can get it going. This is one reason why I'm not super fond of matches, is they tend to change as they get older. They get damp and things. They get harder to light. So I'm getting a fire there. If I wanted to, I could build that into a fire. So now the question is, what do I do if I'm in a place where I haven't had time to collect nice, fine, dry stuff like this, or, you know, it's just not available? There's a trick. And the trick is, if you've got a knife and a piece of wood, you can make that really small, fine kindling just by splitting it like so. And even if your wood that you found is really wet, a lot of times you can find dry stuff at the center. So now that I've got a piece like this, I think I'm going to get some of the bark off the bottom here and just further split it down. You can do it this way and split it like that, and it'll pop them right open like that, or you can continue to split it this way or however you want. Now you can take one of these thinner pieces, and there's a bunch of ways to do this. Just put your knife tip on there. My favorite way is to do it like that, and you can split off a piece. And you get some small, real fine, dry pieces of kindling this way. Of course, there are a lot of other ways to get kindling, but I just decided to try and practice the one that's shown with matches, and very shortly he shows a bunch of other ways to do this. We'll see if we can get this to work here. Should be able to strike these anywhere, since they're strike anywhere. And it's burning. I'm gonna blow this out before it gets too crazy. I'm not trying to start a fire, just trying to see if I can make what is in the diagram work. And that's it for this episode. In the next episode, I'm going to try to cover some of the flint and steel stuff that comes in the next pages of the book.